On July 2, 1934, Crescent Lake Bible Camp opened its first season of Christian camps for young people. This camp was the dream of Arthur Perkins, a Presbyterian minister from Merrill, Wisconsin. Located at Crescent Lake near Rhinelander, Wisconsin, this was his dream of a camp that would be accessible and affordable to young people, but also of a camp that would preach the Word of God, the pure gospel of Jesus Christ from the Scriptures without compromise. This camp was not without controversy. In fact, in 1935, charges were brought against Reverend Perkins for his involvement here at this camp. A trial was held, a conviction was secured, and a censure was brought against him. We are here at Crescent Lake Bible Camp for a conference examining the life and legacy of this remarkable servant of Jesus Christ. In our conference, there are 7 lectures and 4 sermons written by Reverend Perkins, delivered by me, Reverend Brian DeYoung, the pastor of Grace Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. This conference is the production of the archivist and historian of the Presbytery of Wisconsin and Minnesota of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, done in conjunction with our good friends from WVCY-TV and with the help of the Crescent Lake Board and staff. Well, welcome back to our Arthur Perkins Conference, where we are examining the life and legacy of a truly extraordinary man. My name is Brian DeYoung. I'm the pastor of Grace Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Sheboygan, and I'm also the archivist and historian of our presbytery. Now, in order to understand the founding and the significance of the Crescent Lake Bible Camp, we really need to go back to 1931 and an event that took place in the Winnebago Presbytery related to Art's role as the field director. In 1931, at the presbytery meeting, the Christian Education Committee had a plan to remove Perkins from being the field director. Now, this was highly unusual because the Christian Education Committee had no authority over or responsibility for the work of the field director. That was the purview of the National Missions Committee that handled home mission affairs. But the men on that Christian Ed Committee really did not appreciate Art Perkins. A number of those men were modernist, theological liberals, and they did not like his theological conservatism. And so they came prepared with a recommendation to essentially fire him. They had not consulted with the National Missions Committee. They had not notified the chairman of that committee. This was all a surprise attack. And so they pulled Art aside during the meeting, and they told him, "We are prepared to recommend to the presbytery that you not be continued as the field director. We won't do that if you promise to resign, and then we won't even bring it up." Art asked some very perceptive questions. Does my committee, the National Missions Committee, know about this? Does the chairman, Dr. Erickson, does he know about this? Have you notified anyone on the National Mission Committee? Their answers were no, no, and no. He refused to resign, and he basically told them, give it a try, see if it works. So they took their recommendation to the floor of the presbytery, and they explained that they just felt Art was not particularly fit for that role as field director, and that he would be better served in a different position. It was debated, and when it came to a vote, a slim majority of the ministers voted in favor of firing Perkins. But when it came to the votes of the ruling elder commissioners from the churches, they were strongly against it, and the motion failed. Well, the Christian Ed Committee was not satisfied. They had lost the vote, but they still wanted him gone. So later in the year, they took the matter to the Administrative Council of the Synod of Wisconsin. And they basically said, we have all of these troubles in Winnebago Presbytery, and Arthur Perkins is the reason for our troubles. The chairman of the Administrative Council, the president, had a personal friendship with Art Perkins. And they had a gentleman's agreement that if any time the president thought that Art should resign, Art would turn in his resignation. So the president went to Art and said, you remember our gentleman's agreement. I think it's time for you to resign for the good of the presbytery. And being a man of his word, Art offered his resignation. When he got back home and told Dr. Erickson, who was the chairman of the Home Missions Committee, what had happened, Dr. Erickson was livid. The Christian Education Committee had gone behind his back and tried to usurp his authority. And he was very happy with Art's work as the field director. So he went to the Administrative Council at a subsequent meeting, and he argued strongly for the continuation of Art Perkins as the field director. The Administrative Council, after much debate, hearing from both sides, decided that they would not accept Art's resignation and that he would be continued. So he served another 3 years as field director. This was a failed coup attempt. They were trying to take him out, and they had failed at the presbytery level, and they had failed at the synodical level. So their antennae were up. They were looking for another angle to come after him, to seek to discredit him, and to remove him and his influence from the presbytery. Now, during all of his years as the field director in Winnebago, Arthur Perkins spent considerable time with the ordinary people of the rural churches in northeastern Wisconsin. The Great Depression had made life very difficult for these rural folk. They were not able to save large amounts of money. Now, as I've mentioned already, Perkins had a great interest in young people. His heart was full of compassion for children, and he was always interested in ministering to the youth. And from that commitment rose one of his greatest achievements, which also turned out to be some of the ammunition for his enemies to bring him down. And I'm speaking about the Crescent Lake Bible Camp project. This camp was originally founded as a non-denominational Christian camp for rural young people who simply could not afford to attend the presbytery's other camps. Their camps, held at Green Lake and Chetek, Wisconsin, cost over $10 per week for a single camper, and most of the rural families simply could not afford such an expense. Crescent Lake would offer a week at camp for about 1/3 of that cost, and they offered generous scholarship help to those who could not even afford $3 for a week. Now, the genesis of the Crescent Lake Camp is traced to various sources. In 1931, Art and Marie built a small cabin on Crescent Lake. It was within easy driving distance from Merrill, where they were living. In June of 1932, Art was contacted by the pastor of the Anawa Presbyterian Church. This brother minister had some young men that he wanted to take on a camping trip with some spiritual emphasis. So Perkins generously offered their cabin on Crescent Lake, as well as offering to come and help teach the boys. At the dedication service for the Crescent Lake Camp, held on July 22, 1934, the story is recounted as follows. In 1932, he invited a group of boys from the Presbyterian Church in Anawa with their pastor, Mr. Curry. Such a blessing resulted that it was borne upon Mr. Perkins' heart the need for such an outing for young people. That initial experience fired his imagination. Now, at the same time, a group of ministers in Minnesota were pioneering a Bible camp of their own for young people at Grindstone Lake near the town of Sandstone, Minnesota. In a brief history of the founding of the Grindstone Lake Camp, the author says this: a brother of the pastor at Mora, in whose home the Grindstone Lake Bible Camp had been inaugurated, visited the Bible camp that first year and was so impressed that he went back to his home in Wisconsin and told the Reverend Arthur F. Perkins of Merrill, Wisconsin, what he had witnessed in Minnesota. This resulted in a move by Mr. Perkins to start a similar camp in his district. So it's coming from various angles. His own experience with the boys from Anawa, and then this other camp, and all of the thoughts and dreams and imagination is running away. He is excited about the possibilities. Sometime in late 1933, Perkins learned that a piece of lakeshore property near his cabin on Crescent Lake had become available for purchase at a very reasonable price. He invited his friend and confidant, Ernest Tremblay, to go visit the property with him. After looking over the land, they discussed their dreams for a camp. They wanted a camp that would be affordable for these rural families, a camp that would hold to the scriptural gospel and teach the truth of God's Word. Carrie Fenton, in her book, A Costly Dream, records what happened next. And this is from the perspective of Ernest Tremblay. $10 would hold an option to buy until the necessary $400 could be raised. We stopped at a stump and knelt to pray about such an investment. I pulled out my last $5 and said, "Here's the first $5 for that option." Perkins took out his last $5 and said, "Here's another." And that day, the Crescent Lake Bible Camp was born. Now, Perkins quickly began contacting interested parties in order to raise the necessary funds. He sent a letter to a generous donor in the Winnebago Presbytery, Mr. Shattuck. And although Shattuck declined to give to the property and to the purchase, he did provide some small encouragement to Arthur Perkins. Perkins also contacted the pastors of the rural churches that were under his authority as the field director. He proposed that if 10 churches could give $40 apiece, they would have what was needed to make the purchase. Well, the money was raised and steps were taken to organize the Crescent Lake Bible Fellowship with a board of directors. It's important to note that these men were not all Presbyterians, and the camp was never designed to be or considered or advertised as a Presbyterian camp for Presbyterian young people. In fact, it was decidedly a non-denominational camp from the very inception. In February 1934, the board met and began the organizational process for incorporating under the laws of the state of Wisconsin. The Crescent Lake Camp was designed to be a non-stock, non-profit sharing fellowship held in trust by 12 directors and administered by them for carrying out its purposes. The proper paperwork was submitted and approved by the Wisconsin Secretary of State in the summer of 1934. A constitution was prepared as well as a doctrinal statement. Now, it's interesting that the doctrinal statement that was adopted and used was not a Presbyterian statement. It was borrowed almost verbatim from a fundamentalist organization that was not Presbyterian. Well, plans were also put in place very quickly to begin building on the site in the hopes of holding camps for boys, girls, and older teens during the summer of 1934. Perkins was functioning as the president of the board, and he was clearly the leading personality in that fellowship. The next meeting of the board was scheduled for April 10, 1934, in conjunction with a presbytery meeting to be held in Oshkosh. Now, to understand what happened at that presbytery meeting, we need to go back to 1928. Efforts were made to start a presbytery camp at Archibald Lake in northeastern Wisconsin, about an hour and a half away from Crescent Lake. There were already 2 Presbyterian camps in operation at this time. One was in Green Lake, west of Fond du Lac. The other was at Lake Chetek in northwestern Wisconsin. And both of these 2 camps were used by several of the presbyteries, but neither of these camps was within the bounds of Winnebago Presbytery. And both of those camps regularly featured speakers who taught liberalism and modernism. Winnebago wanted its own camp within its own bounds, and Archibald Lake, near the small town of Townsend, was chosen. Land was offered for sale, money was pledged for the purchase. And 2 men were particularly involved in that project. W.A. Holt, the president of a lumber company, and Mr. Shattuck, the wealthy donor that I mentioned earlier. Now, these 2 men were businessmen, and they could see the growing rift in the presbytery between the fundamentalists and the modernists. They did not like to see the division that was growing, and so they concluded that their plan for the Archibald Lake camp should be put on hold until the dispute was settled. Well, without any support or activity, the project essentially went dormant. Eventually, some of the money that had already been given was returned to donors. And in his letter to Perkins, where he declined to contribute towards Crescent Lake, Shattuck had said that he was fed up with camp projects and that the Archibald Lake plan was, quote, pretty dead at the present, end quote. Now, because of the financial hardships of the Great Depression, the prospects for restarting plans for Archibald Lake were gloomy. Nobody expected it ever to materialize. There was one man in the presbytery a modernist who was not going to give up on Archibald Lake. He even invested some of his own money in keeping this idea going. He seemed to take some personal pride in Archibald Lake, and he took personal offense at the plans for Crescent Lake. This man would become Perkins' nemesis in the presbytery and did much to further the persecution and the prosecution of Perkins later on. Now, somehow or other, in the spring of 1934, the modernists in Winnebago Presbytery heard that Perkins and others were planning a camp at Crescent Lake. This was their opportunity to renew their attack on Perkins and his fundamentalist friends in the presbytery. At the April 1934 meeting of Presbytery in Oshkosh, there was a surprising development. A motion was made recommending that any members of Presbytery who were connected with the Crescent Lake Project should cut their ties with the camp, and that it should not be promoted as a Presbyterian enterprise or as a private camp for Presbyterian young people. In the wording of the motion, the term recommend was used repeatedly and in significant places. Well, Perkins and others connected with the board of Crescent Lake took this to be a suggestion that could be ignored, and they did choose to ignore it. The modernists who made that motion had something different in mind. They viewed it as more of a requirement. According to the man who made the motion, the Reverend Claude Shaver, once that motion passed by a majority of the presbytery, the recommendation turned into a requirement. It was now a mandate to be obeyed. And to disobey this mandate constituted rebellion against the rightful authority of the presbytery, a chargeable offense. Furthermore, when they said that it should not be promoted as a Presbyterian camp or a private camp for Presbyterian young people, they apparently meant it should not be promoted at all, not even as a non-denominational camp. Well, as he tried to process what was happening all around him, Art Perkins sensed that a trap was being set. He spoke up during the debate, and in his trial, he testified about what he said at that meeting on April 10, 1934. I said that if it could be proved that this camp or organization was unchristian, illegal, or unpresbyterian, I would stop and desist. And then later on in his discussion and debate, he repeated his pledge. If it was unchristian, illegal, or unpresbyterian, he would stop and desist. Now, in the official minutes of the presbytery, this was recorded in a different way. The minutes read, Reverend A.F. Perkins, president of the camp directors, indicated that he would desist from further promotion of the Crescent Lake camp if shown that it was inclined to make discord and contrary to the will of presbytery if presbytery so voted. After this declaration, twice made by Brother Perkins, the following recommendation of the Judicial Committee was read by the Reverend Claude R. Shaver. Now, I would suggest to you there's a significant difference between unchristian, illegal, or unpresbyterian and contrary to the will of the presbytery. This official interpretation would later be used as part of the evidence in the charges against him, as if he had somehow perjured himself by his continued involvement with the camp board. There was another odd thing at that meeting. The motion came from the Judicial Committee of Winnebago Presbytery. Now, typically, if a matter was to be referred to the Judicial Committee, there would need to be some debate on the floor of Presbytery, and even a motion to refer the matter in question to the Judicial Committee. But no such debate and no such motion ever occurred. It is mysterious how the Judicial Committee was given this matter without any action from the presbytery. It was plainly unconstitutional, and it was the first of many abnormalities in the judicial process against Perkins. Well, again, sensing that a trap had been set for him, Perkins gathered the other Crescent Lake board members together for a meeting after the presbytery had adjourned. And he went around the table and asked each one of them, "What did you hear me say?" And each one of them independently heard him say, "Unchristian, illegal, or unpresbyterian." They made a record in their minutes for future use, and they communicated it to the presbytery, though it did no good. After this ordeal, Perkins and his friends were in the crosshairs. Not wanting the camp to be harmed by his enemies, Perkins voluntarily stepped aside as the president of the board. Now, he continued to serve in a variety of capacities, and I believe he continued to be the leading personality in the fellowship, but he anticipated that more was coming against him. The summer of 1934 saw the first set of camps for young people. In early July, there was a week for the girls, followed by a week for the boys, and then the final week was for older teens. And the cost for that first year of camp was $3.50 and some canned vegetables. One camper that summer was Donald Mcdowell. During the trial of Arthur Perkins in July of 1935, this 19-year-old testified about the effect that the camp had upon him. Donald said, "I was a half-hearted Christian before I went to Crescent Lake, but I was wholly converted last year, 1934, at the camp. I have attended other camps for young people, my attendance at Crescent Lake being my 21st camp. In my opinion, the Crescent Lake Project in its spiritual value is so far superior to other camps that there is no comparison. And I intend to return to Crescent Lake if the project is to be continued." That year at the camp, they had an essay contest for the young people. And I want to read to you the first prize essay by a young man named Albert Dirksen. It is heartwarming and funny and spiritually encouraging. Albert says, "I came to Crescent Lake with the idea clearly expressed, as far as I was concerned, that I wasn't going to get much enjoyment out of anything. I suppose that it was partly because I was going to miss some very worldly pleasures that I had planned on. And then it cost $1 of my money, which I wanted to use to help pay for a bicycle. Anyway, it took me till Friday morning to get over my grouch and admit that I had received something very worthwhile out of Crescent Lake. Now I can truthfully say that it has been invaluable to me as far as reconsecration of myself is concerned. It was good to be here. A new trust in God and God's Word that before now I have never fully experienced. It makes so much difference in my Christian life. Heretofore, I guess I've trusted too much on my own strength, my own feelings, on what I felt was the right thing, and not near enough on God's instructions. Another highly important thing that has been brought home to me is the importance of the death of Jesus Christ in my life. If anyone had asked me before this week what the crucifixion of Christ really meant to me, I should have told them that it meant my sins were paid for, and all a sinner had to do was accept him to be saved. And even this would have been because I had that drilled into me in Sunday school and couldn't forget it. I hadn't realized what a great price he paid for me. The unlawful and unjust conviction, the hurt it must have cost him to have Peter deny him thrice, the rough treatment by his chosen people in the courts, then the terrible pain that there was there when he was nailed onto that cross and raised up and dropped into the hole prepared for the base of it. It can be said that he endured every physical and mental pain possible that day, and that he died of a broken heart with the face of his Father turned away from him. If I gain nothing else this week, I can say with all my heart, it was good to be here. But I really have enjoyed some wonderful times this week, even though worldly things kept me from knowing what a real time I was getting. I love swimming, and it gives me something to work for to have so many chances to do it. I don't believe I could answer by name all the boys that have known me ever since I came, and it makes me feel good to know that I have so many Christian friends. I think, though, that I have enjoyed most the musical talent displayed among my fellow students. And now, as I think back over everything that has gone before, the little irritations, the disappointments, alongside the good fellowship, the Christian teaching, and the friends I've made, I can say that it brought home to me in a real way, God leads us even though sometimes we don't know it and sometimes we don't want to follow. I can say with feeling as I close, it was good to be there. God bless you, Albert Dirksen. Now, despite the obvious success of the first camps at Crescent Lake in the summer of 1934, more trouble was on the horizon for September. At the fall 1934 meeting of Winnebago Presbytery, this matter of Crescent Lake would be revisited and the conflict would intensify. The modernists now held a majority in Winnebago Presbytery, and their pressure on Arthur Perkins would ratchet up significantly. Well, in our next lecture, we will look more carefully at modernism and why Arthur Perkins resisted it as he did. Well, thank you for your attention to this video and this conference. I trust that it has been of spiritual encouragement and help to you, and that it has given you some historical data that you were not aware of. There will be a biography of Arthur Perkins forthcoming. The title is Standing Against Tyranny, The Life and Legacy of Arthur Perkins. I am the author, and it will be published through Amazon.com. Lord willing, we will also have an audiobook available for that. For information, please contact me, Brian DeYoung, at Grace Orthodox Presbyterian Church, 4930 Green Valley Lane, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, 53083. Thank you.